welcome to the Social Impact webinar series. Tonight, the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise and the Stanford C. Bernstein Center for Leadership and Ethics at Columbia University are so excited to host a fireside chat with Ben Anderson, CEO of B Lab US and Canada, in conversation with Georgia Levenson Keohane, adjunct associate professor at Columbia Business School. It's my pleasure to introduce both of them to you now. So Ben Anderson leads market-based work with certified B corporations, B Corps, benefit corporation governance, and impact management tools. He's also a member of the global leadership team, which governs the global network of B Lab, Sistema B regional partners. Ben joined B Lab after a career as a social entrepreneur, including serving as COO at Preserve, a certified B Corp, which is best known for turning yogurt cups into toothbrushes and running innovative closed loop recycling systems. Earlier in his career, Ben developed, directed, and expanded a range of urban education programs, including founding a Boston charter school, founding an academic program with the Stepping Stone Foundation, and directing a campus for citizen schools. He received his BA from Williams College and an MBA from Babson. He currently lives in Brooklyn, New York, with his wife and 2 high school-aged children. And a little about our wonderful moderator, Georgia Levenson Keohane, has more than 20 years of experience in the private and nonprofit sectors at the intersection of capital markets, responsible investing, business, philanthropy, and public policy. Most recently, she's worked as president of the Nawab Capital Partners Foundation and head of the firm's environmental, social, and governance practice, and president of its corporate foundation. And before that, she was the executive director of the Pershing Square Foundation. She is also an award-winning author, a professor of social enterprise at Columbia Business School, and host of the business school's newest podcast, Capital for Good. In 2020, Georgia helped to lead one of New York City's COVID-19 emergency response relief efforts and has focused on the importance of stakeholder capitalism in times of crisis. We're so happy to welcome you guys, and I'll turn it over to Georgia for some moderated questions. If you guys have questions along the way, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. Enjoy, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you, Margaret, and the Student Leadership and Ethics Board of the Bernstein Center, and my colleagues at the Tamer Center for Social Enterprise. This is a wonderful event tonight. And again, I applaud all of you. We're a year into this very unusual and challenging set of circumstances, and you've all just done an extraordinary job. And so I'm, grateful that everyone is keeping at it, and hopeful that things will continue to improve. So delighted to be here with Ben Anderson and talk a little bit about responsible business broadly, and B Lab certification work more specifically. Ben, you've had an interesting career as an entrepreneur, and wearing many hats in the social sector before joining B Lab and sort of turning your gaze towards helping certify other businesses. I'm just wondering if you could give all of us a little bit of a sort of flavor of the arc of your career, how you landed at B Lab, how you think about B Corps, and what brings you here tonight.
Great. Thank you, Georgia, for having me, and just wonderful to be here with all of you. As you look back on your career, sometimes it seems like it's a pretty straight path and it all makes sense and it's logical, but it never does when you're kind of future oriented and heading into it. And so my career out of undergrad began in consulting, and after a few years, I found myself in a skyscraper working for an oil company as a client. And I think I had to take stock in like, what was I here on earth to do? And so the digging deep headed me into about a decade in education. So I grew up in Boston, and so wanted to focus on the Boston public school system. So I was mostly working kind of in partnership with the public schools through after school programs, eventually a charter school as well. And but I felt like I also wanted to stay connected to the business world, and that's why I chose to go to business school and not some other grad programs. And I went to Babson, and out of that, and it's focused on entrepreneurship, connected with another Babson entrepreneur who had started a company, Preserve, as was introduced, it makes closed loop products. And so I really got to experience the power of business driving, social good, and kind of particularly in that company focused on environmental things. And then after being there about 9 years, I was kind of looking for so now what do I want to do? And I had such a powerful experience being a member of the B Corp community that in conversation with one of the founders of B Lab, there was an opportunity to kind of take what I had learned there and try to help scale impact through systems change at B Lab. And so have now moved to San Francisco for 5 of the past years, and now in New York for the past 2 years. So here just in time for the pandemic.
Welcome. So that's terrific. So I'm assuming that most of our listeners and participants this evening, if they've signed on, have a sense of what the B Corp movement is sort of all about, and and B Lab's work, but might not as consumers. Whether they're sort of eating Ben and Jerry's or wearing Patagonia, they might not know the full origin story of the B Corp movement and B Lab's role and sort of how we've gotten to where we are today. I think we take a lot of this for granted, that this work is pretty mainstream and that stakeholder capitalism is sort of alive and well and has always been, but it's not always true. So, Ben, if you could just give a little bit of background to the movement and the organization and the work to put us in context today.
Yeah, be happy to do that. Yeah, it's stakeholder capitalism was not on everybody's tongues maybe 15 years ago, or even the term shareholder primacy. And the 3 founders of B Lab are Jay, Bart, and Andrew. They're Stanford classmates. One of them went on to a private equity career, Andrew, and then Bart and Jay were involved in starting and scaling a company called And1. It's a basketball kind of sneaker and apparel company some people may know. And so out of the experience of scaling that company, focusing on community, embedding into their supply chain specific practices, sort of on exit, they experienced kind of a divergence from the path that they wanted the company to be on to where it sort of went on to. And so as they were thinking in that post-sale period, one of the companies they looked at was Newman's Own. And so that model of, in that case, sort of giving all your profits to good, it eventually kind of evolved into establishing a brand and performance standards for companies. And so initially, I think they thought there'd be other Newman's type products, but eventually focused on B, which stands for benefit, but we've also leveraged to mean many other things too, and it usually comes back to benefit. And so we now have sort of one of the leading performance standards for business globally, with 3,800 companies around the world in over 70 countries. And we can talk a little bit about sort of the benefit corp distinction, but there's also influencing the laws in the US and laws globally, which is really exciting. And it's great to see, the Business Roundtable and others, World Economic Forum, talking about stakeholder capitalism, seeing companies at least talking about it. And hopefully that will lead to more action, and we're here to catalyze that.
Terrific. So maybe actually, while you brought it up, just for sort of some definitional clarity, because I'm gonna ask you, I think, primarily to focus on what B Corp certification is really all about, and you've clearly gone through it again as an entrepreneur, and now you sort of are overseeing it more broadly with other companies. But but I do think the B Corp and then certified public benefit corporation distinction, for the lawyers among us, is just a useful distinction, because my sense is they sometimes get a little bit confused or confusing. And if you could just talk about the two a little bit.
Absolutely. So B Corps, or certified B corporations, is the certification that B Lab, the nonprofit, the 501c3 based in the US, but with a global partnership now around the globe, we recruit and engage, certify companies. And so part of the certification is meeting a certain bar of performance, and we can talk more about that, I think, probably down the road here. So meeting that performance standard, making that performance transparent. And then the third part that this kind of leans on is accountability. And so there is a governance requirement for all B Corps around the world to kind of shift from a shareholder focus model to one that is governed considering other stakeholders, or the stakeholders of the business. And so in order to accomplish that in the US, we actually had to pass laws and create the benefit corporation. So B Lab is behind both the certification, but the benefit corp legislation was started to serve the certification. And so while in the US there are 1,800 certified B Corps, there are now 10,000 companies that have incorporated. So in order to be certified, you have to either elect to convert your company to become a benefit corp. So if you're a C Corp in Delaware, that's the way you achieve our governance requirement. If you're an LLC, you can actually just amend the operating agreement. So you're still establishing what we call as benefit corp governance, but the benefit corporation specifically refers to a C Corp. Is expanding fiduciary duty, and you still stay a C Corp, but you call yourself benefit corp when you make that shift.
Okay, terrific. And could you talk a little bit then about the certification process? So maybe, you know, how you thought about sort of when you went through it, and explain how, you know, how you rate on the different dimensions, whether it's, you know, workers, communities, you know, the environment, et cetera. And literally, like, as you went through it as a company and how you think about it, you know, you're working with so many different companies of different sizes across industries, et cetera. And so anyway, sort of the nuts and bolts and basics, but then we'll probe a little further, you know, how you weight companies for the actual nature of their products and or size or whatever.
Yeah, great. So the B impact assessment is the standard system that we use. And so you open that front door, and there's actually about 100 variants of the assessment that are based on your number of employees and your geography, and also the type of business, because, for instance, measuring impact of a marketing firm versus manufacturing firms can be really different. So the standards all align with social, environmental, worker governance, and customer practices. But sometimes we have to modify what the standard is and change the weighting based on that. But it should look and feel like pretty similar and extremely rigorous, and companies will answer about 100 questions. And then we will do an audit and review and go through and evaluate if a company meets the standard. Often we will not be knocking the score back after we do a first review, and then companies will need to sort of bear out policies or practices, provide payroll data if they're have a percentage of their employees that are being paid a living wage. And so I think what's exciting about it is there's a lot of ways up the mountain to become a B Corp. It's not prescriptive. And so if you're focused on worker ownership, great. If you're focused on pay ratio, or you're focused on the environment, there's a diversified way of qualifying to the 80 points that we require. It's not prescriptive. There's 200 potential points that you can get. Although increasingly we're looking for companies to be meeting certain minimum requirements, and that's something that's like really actively in play on the standards right now. Is like, do you have to actually be net zero or pay a living wage to just qualify to be a B Corp? So that's something that's emergent and just signaling, and we've written about and is accessible on our site.
And in your experience, again, all companies are different, but what do you see as the primary motivation or motivations for companies to certify? Is that they're trying to signal to consumers in the marketplace, you know, with this certification and branding? Is it that they are hearing from their employees that this is important? Do they seek out a community of like-minded companies? All of the above. I'm curious at some of the trends that you've seen over time that bring more companies into the fold.
Yeah, I would. I typically sort of divide them into kind of internal facing, external facing. And honestly, for the first maybe decade or so, I usually would just say if a company was interested in becoming a B Corp, just assume there's no external facing benefits, because there's so many internal facing benefits. One is you're locking in mission as a founder. You have these guardrails that are helping you as you grow or take on capital, like stay aligned with the value system. It's great for recruiting and retaining talent. And that's true. And there also have been external facing benefits, but I just kind of have changed the mode. And also, like, we were early and new, and there were a lot of that came in the community without the brand being known. But we're now at the point where we're 100 billion in revenues combined, B Corps globally, hundreds of thousands of employees. And I would challenge probably anybody on this call is like, if you go into your pantry, chances are you're going to find one product that has a B. And actually my wife bought something yesterday. I didn't even know it was a B Corp. And she's like, oh my gosh, this company's a B Corp. And so that's even sort of exciting. There's so many, I don't even know them all at this point. And so increasingly, like when you have a company like Danone who has Wallaby yogurt and the Danone brands, like putting it on Horizon Milk, it's on hundreds of thousands and millions of packages. It's increasingly known, particularly through food and apparel companies or like Athleta. And so we have not focused on consumer awareness in the early days. We focused on the business leaders' awareness. And so we had pretty high awareness. But as companies have come in, and only about a quarter of the community's consumer products companies, most people think it's many more because that's what they interact with. But we've seen the brand go from 3 or 4% awareness, like general public awareness in the US, I think into the like 25-35% range in the last 3 or 4 years. So it's pretty dramatic increase. And I think increasingly there'll be more external benefits too.
And have you talk a little bit about the similarities and differences, and the marketplace is surrounding sustainability and ESG and all of these sort of, and impact and all these buzzwords is only getting more crowded and more complicated. You guys are not tourists in the space. You've been here for a while, but ESG can mean lots of different things to lots of different people and lots of different companies and lots of different investors.
Mm-hmm.
There are clearly strong parallels and similarities in terms of what you are asking companies to measure and perform on, what ESG investors are. Could you just talk a little bit about how you see similarities and differences, and maybe it's just not even relevant at all?
Yeah, it's a good question. We often, particularly in the earlier, days, like who are your competitors, or who should I be choosing between? And I think it's often that they're complementary. And so for instance, we have lots of companies, hundreds of companies, I think, that are 1% for the planet and a certified B Corp, or who are using fair trade, or have LEED certified buildings. And we really we stand on the shoulders of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of other certifiers who are measuring greenhouse gas emissions. And like, there's lots of others that are part of this ecosystem. And so we tend to not think of ourselves as competitors. We do have kind of a roll up of other certifications, but it's usually you're using a combination of tools like GRI, and we just issued a report kind of comparing, contrasting GRI and sort of what we do and what they do. But often our assessment was designed to certify companies, and so people tend to talk about it as more of a management tool than a reporting tool, but it can also be used for reporting. Whereas a lot of the other kind of ESG players, I think people tend to think of them as there's a way of reporting, but there's not a specific level or standard. And we're actually making a values judgment on different elements across sort of all these factors so you can go in and see publicly the weighting we assign to a living wage versus like the ratio of pay equity from CEO to lowest paid employee.
And the number of certified B Corps, as you've described, both in the US and globally, sort of exploded, and and there's so much interest and so much enthusiasm, and it's sort of exponential. On the other hand, in terms of the universe of all businesses, it's still relatively small. And over the years, as I've sort of discussed this with your colleagues and others, they've sort of said, that's fine with us. Our mission isn't necessarily to have every company certify, but you make these tools available to companies whether or not they choose to certify. And I know are also involved in all of these other cool efforts, sort of like best, I know New York City, there have been years where we sort of do best of and everything else. So could you talk about how you think the certification tool is sort of one tool, but how you think about the larger universe of sort of responsible business and activities and behavior, and how you engage that way too?
Yeah, great question. And we don't have a belief that we're going to certify every company, but what we've been able to do, particularly over the last 10 years, is get increasing leverage out of the community of leaders kind of leading in different directions. And so one of those ways is just if you take the certified B Corps in the US 1800 to 10,000 plus benefit corps, you've got all these companies, people are founding companies, and they're using those stakeholder kind of governance practices from the start. So that's one. Another one would be the number of users of the B Impact Assessment. It's a public good. Anybody can use it. There's tons of resources, and I would encourage anybody on here who's either going to go join another business or where you're working or you're starting a business. There's tons of information inside. And so the number of users there is like 100,000. And so there's a great leverage point from sort of 4,000 B Corps to 100,000 users. And then kind of where we're going increasingly as a community and having impact is through collective action and coalitions. And so one of the newer coalitions called Imperative 21, this campaign you'll see behind me is about resetting capitalism or resetting to a more inclusive economy. And so there are partners like CECP, Just Capital, the GIN, Common Future, Participant Media, which is also B Corp, and the B Team. Like collectively, we have tremendous impact. And so we are seeking kind of, many of us have kind of done our own thing. We're trying to just get our footing. And now we're seeing a lot of power and kind of aligning. And so, for instance, all the players that I've mentioned there are like the thing that we've been really into is this kind of shifting from shareholder primacy to stakeholder governance, in addition to the performance piece. But that's something that like B Lab has really like staked out is like important. And so we're getting power out of these coalitions and collective actions with other companies.
Okay, and I'm sure, I know as we, we'll go back and forth a little bit more and then open up to questions. I'm sure there will be many questions about some of these larger coalitions. I want to come back a little bit on the certification or on the companies sort of within your universe, both in the US and around the world. Am I right that at least historically, companies have tended to be private companies rather than public, although I know that there are some public that have certified and some private that have B Corps that have IPO'd. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship of sort of private to public, and some of the use cases, the test cases that you've wanted to see in terms of sort of embedding some of the, responsibility into the DNA. Anyway, just trends you're seeing.
Yeah. I mean, there's been a ton of activity on the public markets. You're right. It's mostly private companies, like 99% private companies. But we're getting a lot of growth out of public companies. And we have also had a number of public companies own certified B Corps. So Unilever owns Ben & Jerry's, and Danone owns like tons of brands, or the Gap owns Athleta. And so the precedents I think we've had public company owning, either buying or converting. In the case of Gap, they were converting. In the case of Unilever, they've been buying up a lot of B Corps. Then you've had a B Corp IPO, pre-Benefit Corp, and then you've had a certified B Corp that's also Benefit Corp, and Laureate that then did an IPO. You've had Natura, which is a public company in Brazil that has converted on their exchange to become a Benefit Corp, and then they acquired the Body Shop, and also Avon. You've got a stock swap situation going on there, and then you've also had a company like Lemonade, which is an insurance company that IPO'd this year. Is I think one of the most successful IPOs of the year. And so the way we've been kind of moving forward is kind of cracking through on different precedents so that others can follow. We found that, like, even when I started at B Lab 7 years ago, it was like, are investors going to be okay with this? And by now, like most private equity companies, venture cap firms have a B Corp in their portfolio. It's not this like scary thing, like the governance is going to change. And so these companies are built for the long term. And I think we're going to have some great data on the other side of the pandemic that will show that B Corps are more resilient, financially resilient in these tough times. And so, for instance, our attrition rate from our community is the lowest it's been in 5 years, and our demand has grown 60% during COVID. So we've seen companies stay close. So they're picking the things that are important to them. And then we're having this magnetic attraction from other companies that see this is like how companies are built to last and are coming towards us. So much so that we're kind of grappling with the demand.
So I was actually going to ask you exactly about sort of what you've observed. Are there material trends that you've been able to observe during COVID? And it sounds like, even more activity and sort of doubling down on some of these issues and perhaps attracting even more companies to the certification process. I don't know if there are others that you've seen. Clearly so many companies, especially small ones, but companies have struggled. This has been a tough year, although others have thrived. I'm curious if there are other sort of COVID trends, or it might be a little too soon to tell.
Yeah. One thing that was really interesting to us, we have a B Corp called Forest Marsh Group that does research. They're based sort of in the DC area. And they surveyed our community and we're trying to diagnose, like we thought, oh my gosh, like we're going to lose demand, and our revenues are dependent on their ability to pay annual fees. And what we saw was, we definitely see companies like severely impacted. And so we remobilized our whole team to make sure they had access to the funds that were available through the government. And those really went a long way. But we even saw companies who were in a financially challenging situation, say, half of them saying, I'm here to help others. And so that's like part of the ethos of, I think what like differentiates what we're doing is like foundationally, it's all about community and in creating community, which is like, we're not really a certification, we're really more a B Corp community. And to get in the door, you have to certify, but increasingly we're kind of welcoming others who are not certified into our network. And so we saw a lot of power out of B Corps helping each other, B Corps adapting their business models, and all this public market activity as well. And so we've seen the financial markets kind of shifting and public companies moving in. There's even there's a B Corp, or pending B Corp SPAC that incorporated.
That was on my list to test. This would not
All right, let's go. I can only go so deep on SPACs, but if you want to go there, here we go. No, terrific. So so it does sound like what you're seeing is consistent with other trends. You mentioned Just Capital, they're sort of observing this, and Edelman Trust Barometer, the sort of folks who are measuring public perception about companies, the expectation and hope that companies behave responsibly. And in fact, many companies, not all, but many sort of stepping into leadership voids in many instances in this pandemic. And the SPAC. So I talked for a minute about the SPAC. I'm chuckling only because everybody's got to have a SPAC, and I think that, and Andrew Kasoy, am I right, is a director on this sort of the first B Corp SPAC. But I guess you don't need to talk too much about that. But I do want to ask you. I know that there are other. I teach a class, and we've had someone from Towerbrook, private equity firm that's a B Corp come and speak, and it's interesting. And I think I know Towerbrook was the first sort of PE firm. There may be others that have followed, but it was interesting having the conversation because what we sort of realized is they're talking about the GP, but the portfolio companies, I don't think are necessarily sort of covered by the investments aren't, as you mentioned, there are some private equity firms that do have companies in the portfolio that are B Corps, but I'm not sure that their certification extends necessarily to the portfolio. But I guess, how do you, in financial service companies, whether it's a SPAC or PE firm, where there's sort of the initial entity and then there are all these related entities, talk a little bit about some of those distinctions, and we sort of trust that all of these entities are doing these all for the right reasons, but it necessarily begs questions about what this signals to the marketplace versus what companies are actually really doing. Yeah, great question. So specifically on the SPAC. So Andrew Kasoy is one of the co-founders of B Lab. He is on the board of this SPAC, and I said pending B Corp because we do have a a designation for a company that's in its first year of operation. So you have to have a year of operation for us to evaluate something and see if you meet the performance standard. But the big deal there is they started out as a benefit corp. And so they've kind of entered the public market as a benefit. I think that's the bigger distinction. And then, I mean, Andrew's certainly going to hold their feet to the fire, but they're designed to kind of go in a certain direction. You do have to take kind of like a pro forma B impact assessment. So kind of you lay out and start heading in the right direction. And so, yeah, we'll be interested to see. And I had to walk around the block. Andrew lives near me, and I was like, okay, you need to explain this back thing to me. And where are there other opportunities in the B Corp community? So if there's anybody out there who's like got their wheels spinning on like what would be a good kind of B Corp SPAC, like is it kind of rolling up a bunch of brands that are aligned and helping them grow? And my understanding is you got to start with like a kind of a holding company one and then do some acquisitions, but I'm not the financial engineer here. And so I think that answer, and what was the other part of the question? I got diverted by the SPAC.
No, I was asking about sort of private, the different ways that financial service firms, especially ones that you have kind of a holding company or GP, and then there's a community. I know that there are also other, like I think is it Bain Capital Double Impact that uses, I'm not sure the companies on their portfolio are B Corps, but they certainly use the assessment, I think, for all of the companies in their portfolio.
So a company like TowerBrook, we have a bunch of different combinations of this, but TowerBrook is certified. Their portfolio companies are not, because they're independent companies. But investment companies will use the B impact assessment to measure their portfolio. And so we've had a product to help them kind of understand and roll that up. And even until recently, we've had a pretty active product called Gears. People may know Gears. And so there are over 100 funds that were then measuring over 1,000 companies that had Gears rating. We did wind that product down because of the needs of investors for kind of a much more adaptable product. Then we really have the B impact assessment set up for certification. So we decided to wind that down, but many investors are still asking their portfolio to use the BIA. They're still evaluating on that. And sometimes they're requiring them to be certified, and other times they're just encouraging. It just depends on the investor.
Okay. Another sort of B Corp piece of news I read, I guess, this week, and I'm just curious, you probably don't have, I don't know how much you can comment on this company specifically, but I saw you mentioned Danone, which has been incredibly high profile for a whole number of reasons on responsible front, including sort of B Corp. And I know I saw, I guess this week or something, that, the CEO, I think, has had to step down. There was a little bit of like shareholder revolt. I suspect there were a whole number of things at play there. The B Corp piece probably being, the least of it, but there have been some, I remember a few years ago with Etsy and a few other companies, there have been tensions sometimes between owners, founders, corporate leaders who are really, out in front in some cases, and then people get a little bit nervous. You may not want to comment on those two companies specifically, but sort of how do you coach senior leadership through some of this, like being out in front on some of these issues and certifying versus keeping everybody confident that, this is like the commercially right thing to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so on Danone, Danone is really leaned into certification. So certifying Danone North America, which was at the time till very recently the largest certified B Corp, and now Natura is with their acquisitions. But Emmanuel Faber has single-handedly like really helped to spread the seeds around the world of this is a good thing, and including having Danone do the equivalent of what we call benefit corp here in the US. And so that's actually baked into the company. And so that will be a legacy that Emmanuel Faber will have, and they will be held to that standard. And now I think it's something over they've made a commitment to certify the whole company, and somewhere over like 30 or 40% of the company in different places around the world have gone through this. And so he has an incredible legacy as a huge champion of our work. And in the case of Etsy, they joined the community, and many joined the community before Benefit Corp had even been created. And so there are a few companies that were caught kind of based on their investor base in the middle, because we invented something after we started the certification. And so, but I think what they did is they did IPO while they were B Corp, and that kind of like was a first like cracking through, and then others cracked through. That paved the path for Laureate, and that paved the path for Lemonade. And so sometimes there'll be shifts based on what's happening with investors. And you even have somebody like John Mackey at Whole Foods, who came to our conference post acquisition by Amazon, said, "Wow, I wish I had been a Benefit Corp when we had done that, because there would have been kind of some guardrails in place around that acquisition." And so, all of it is, sometimes it feels like it's moving forward or maybe moving back, but it's like ultimately the kind of trend is really positive for this kind of work.
Great. And I think maybe I get one more before we open it up. I guess I'm just, you guys have been at this for a long time, and in some ways the capital markets, as we've discussed, are sort of catching up. And knowing your team and your colleagues, you'll sort of continue to be pioneering and pushing the envelope and sort of, the next stage of this work. I'm curious how you see B-Lab, B Corps, but really the stakeholder capitalism, responsible business, sort of business as a force for good movement going. I mean, what do the next 10 years look like in your crystal ball? Yeah.
I mean, in the US and Canada, we're focused on strategically, like what we're focused on is stakeholder governance. I keep saying that, people are gonna get sick of that, but the way that we basically passed it in 40 plus states. And so our focus right now is on kind of broader policy work to align investors with this as well in terms of their fiduciary duties. We have a proposal for a White House initiative on inclusive economy, try to cross connect the work. So that's where our policy work is heading. We're focusing on being an anti-racist organization and community. So racial equity is kind of the second major pillar of our work. And it's something driving an inclusive economy has been part of the ethos from the beginning, but from a racial equity lens, really sort of newer to us. And so that's a place kind of the other end of the spectrum where we're not leading, we will be looking to others, we're looking to follow, kind of use our power and collective influence. And then kind of in the middle would be climate justice, where we have a lot of climate leaders focus on net zero by 2030. So we have a coalition that a lot of US B Corps, but also part of our global community that's committed to net zero. And so those kind of the three things that we're particularly focused on. Different parts of the globe are focused on different things. So like just even passing Benefit Corp in different jurisdictions is what they may be focused on, just depends on where it is. But I think investors have so much power and influence. And so you're even seeing like stakeholder resolutions come up and asking companies to become Benefit Corps. And we would love to see every company actually just be required to be a Benefit Corp because you are using public resources and goods. You're not paying for the externalities of the impacts. And so we'd like every company to operate that way, ideally.
Terrific. I think, Margaret, am I handing over to you or Diana? Or I can keep going. I got lots of questions, but I know we have a lot of people. I can also see the questions. How do we want to do this?
Hi, I'm back. So
okay.
We have some really awesome Q&A from the audience. So I will just fire away. I really love this first question from Delicia. She says, wow, 100 questions to qualify. How often are the qualifications revisited to ensure minimum requirements are met? And sort of what is your thinking sort of as you move through the years as social justice and the concept of being a good business in the world evolves? How do you revise your assessment?
Yeah, great question. So usually companies, when you go through this process of answering the roughly 100 questions, usually the experience is people are like exhausted. They can't believe they've had to do it, but it's like climbing up on the mountain peak and you're so happy that you got there and you're not, usually it's more just like, oh, I did it versus being sort of upset or angry that they had to do that. It's like, wow, I learned so much about my business. And that was my personal experience. We were very environmentally focused. So we kind of integrated and adopted all these kind of more community and worker oriented practices. We would have qualified anyway, but then you start seeing these guardrails and you're like, that's the kind of business that I want to be. So we're now on 6 versions in of the standards. And so we've probably poured about $35 million just into developing the standards. And so it's been a significant investment. We have a independent standards advisory council that oversees the standards, and so has independent governance. And then what we've had to do, particularly we've gotten into bigger companies and multinationals coming into space, first develop standards for multinationals. And then there's lots of controversial industries. And so we've had to do specific standards development, for instance, on on higher ed, for-profit higher ed. And so when Laureate certified, we had a standards that was developed for that. And so then that next evolution that referred to earlier is what we're evaluating is there some base minimum requirement? Because there's no minimum requirement on any dimension now other than the stakeholder governance one, which you do get points for. And so trying to see if like we as a community actually, like it's just required that you pay a living wage because that's like the right thing to do. And so that's a very active conversation. We've had 1,000 people who have given public comment on this new approach.
Awesome, thank you. Next question is, I know that you mentioned that there was this huge uptick in people wanting to become a B Corp during the pandemic, and that we are really seeing that businesses that are B Corps or that have progressive practices are doing better in the pandemic. But this question is, what is the reason? Why do you specifically think that B Corps are more financially resilient in the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see from sort of June, July, when we saw other companies kind of scrambling that weren't B Corps to like adopt practices that we already had. And so if you already have like flex time, if you already pay like your workers well, if you already give them good health benefits, there are all these things that were like in place. And so what we saw our community doing is not like, oh, we got to change our practices. We more saw saying, hey, how can we adapt? How can we help each other out? And so they're able to kind of look beyond themselves. And so we saw all these other companies getting credit for doing things that we would say are like just part of the normal way of becoming a B Corp. And so it was already like baked in, and those things are very mutually reinforcing, and then it allowed them to be adaptive and supportive to one another.
Awesome. And Georgia, I know that you study, resilience in the pandemic or in the face of crisis. If you have any comments on that as well.
No, I mean, I think what Ben said exactly right. You have sort of, the companies that sort of have been intentional about taking care, again, right, it's going to vary dramatically, but there's some companies in some geographies in particular that are so hard hit by, just an economic shutdown that it's hard to be resilient. That said, I think, we're clearly seeing a lot of evidence that places that intentionally have, thought about their workforce, taken care of folks, reached out to the community, and have been doing that authentically for a long time. That pay, there's a sort of there's a do well and do good dividend. I think that we're now sort of seeing the fruits of.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, this is a good one. I understand the community is one of the greatest benefits, but companies love tax breaks. There are currently no specific tax benefits for B Corps. Are there? Do you plan to pursue that or foresee any benefits like that in the future?
Yeah, we have not pursued that. There are a few out there in different municipalities, but in passing, we were on the policy side really focusing on passing Benefit Corp initially, and we wanted to pass it bipartisan. And so we didn't want to encourage. There's certainly a lot of ask from our community. Should we go after this? We did not want to encourage that. And as a result, we were able to, in most cases, pass this in a pretty bipartisan way. And so that's why we haven't gone after that. But certainly there's lots of power in like government purchasing. And so that would be like a great place if B Corps got some preferential treatment, but it's not been kind of high priority, but I think it's a good idea, but not something we're actively pursuing.
Awesome. Let's see, how do you respond to the claim that stakeholder capitalism essentially stifles or at a minimum slows innovation, in particular when labor has a seat at the table and uses their influence to avoid being replaced by automation?
That's a good question. I haven't had that one before. That's great.
An anonymous attendee, I can't tell you.
Yeah, my experience is like it is, the B Corps are like innovation engines. Like every single day I see new one come across, you know, as the ones that are certified, and the kind of creativity is just bountiful. But I also think like the diversity of perspectives you get when you're really tied and connected with your stakeholders through your supply chain, through your workers, through your investors, through your community, that diversity of opinion, I think actually leads to way more innovation. And so I haven't heard, I'd love to hear more if, in terms of its stifling innovation, because I haven't heard that as an argument. It's certainly more complicated. It's more, you have to like develop systems, and you need to like balance those interests, but the approach does not like require that you like weight it in a certain way. You certainly could. So it's not like dominating or driving your business. It's just like giving you more information. So I'd say it's an information channeling, and if you use it and do it right, you're actually going to learn a ton. I know, Georgia, if you have anything to add to that.
No, again, I mean, I think how we think about employee empowerment, and you know, and sort of, to say nothing of collective bargaining and sort of unionization, et cetera, it's just playing out quite differently in the last, you know, few weeks and months, to say nothing of the last few years. I mean, and you know, Amazon is obviously a pretty compelling example, but I do think the rise outside of B Corps and sort of employee ownership models and that innovation leading to Ben's point, sort of broader innovation in products and services, you know, flips the question a little bit on its head, you know. And then again, depending on how you're defining stakeholders, I think most companies, the closer they can get to the consumer and consumer preferences, you know, and how consumers actually use products, use services, et cetera, you know, leads to much better refinement and innovation in sort of products and goods and services. So might not be super efficient, but probably over the longer term is more fruitful.
Anecdotally, my company is right now in the process of, we've completed the assessment, so we're in the process of applying to become a B Corp. And I would agree with you, Ben. I feel like the amount of information that you gather about your business while you're going through the process, and the amount of frameworks actually is what I found super helpful, that B Lab provides a lot of these frameworks to kind of figure out how to meet your goals as a company. You're right. I think it might slow things in the moment, but generally is setting us up to be a little bit more sustainable as a business in the long run. All right, I like this next one. How does B Lab sustain itself? Does it receive fees from companies? How do you make sure it isn't becoming like an accounting firm that fails to do a good job with auditing?
Yeah, good question. So, you know, over time, I would say the last couple of years, we've been about 60% earned income from annual fees from B Corps. So they pay an annual fee. I think there was another question on this that I'll answer too, is like they have to recertify every 3 years now. And so usually companies will improve during that time, just because you're measuring something, you want to improve on it. And so in the US, actually, we're at scale enough to be kind of self-sustaining based on our earned income. We still will go after philanthropy, but that philanthropy will be mostly targeted at things like our racial equity, climate justice work. And it also allows us to like get ahead of the market. And so like we were ahead of the market on passing Benefit Corp. Nobody kind of knew the world needed that exactly. And so we will always kind of be using it to kind of blaze some new trails, so that B Corps can kind of like go up those trails and then others will follow. So we over time have raised about $70 million, I think, in the last like 14 or so years for this work. So we've definitely been ahead of the market, and in some places are more kind of hit that tipping point of self-sustaining just for the core operations. And then we, in order to like truly scale, we will need to rely on other like auditors or other who are kind of in that space, because we're kind of just chipping along at a fairly linear, growth rate. For it to be more exponential, we'll have to have more partners. So that's something that we've, tested and been trying to figure out, and including that shift in how we certify companies too is one way to maybe make it more accessible and grow faster.
Great. You spoke a little bit earlier about sort of awareness of B Lab in the world. One question asks, will there be a heavy marketing push to build awareness and recruit more companies to become certified at some point?
Yeah, fortunately right now, generating demand is not, we don't spend a lot of time on that, but we're also trying to attract the right types of companies in. But we're just like in a very kind of fortunate position around that. But our approach to kind of building awareness is really to equip B Corps to tell their stories, shine the light on themselves, shine the light on each other. We also have a storytelling platform called Be the Change Media, and we do very well at kind of placing stories in the media. When you have like 1,800 companies who are doing like super cool, interesting, innovative things, it's like really pretty easy to kind of get stories placed. So we have had historically kind of more of an emphasis on that, and actually it's just kind of staffing up to do more kind of focused on PR, but really getting the B Corps are the ones who have the money for this, and it's super expensive to build a brand. And so equipping them to tell their stories is in alignment with what we want to do there.
Any idea how many companies in the US are qualified to be certified but are not currently?
So I think there's like 30 million businesses in the US, if I'm right. And so it's a question like, if everybody could certify, how many would meet that threshold? Is that what you think that question means? Like,
yeah,
how many would be over the 80 bar? Oh, I've definitely dreamed about this. I have no idea. Maybe George, you have a guess. I would guess.
How many tennis balls can you fit in a
I'm guessing like 10, maybe max 10%. It's a really high bar. And some like even Patagonia, when they first certified, just came in at like an 80. They're now like, I think at like 130 or 140. So if they started, 10 years ago at that level, getting to where Patagonia is like, that was 10 years ago was the bar. That's a pretty high bar.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. What is the average score? Are most people kind of just over the threshold, or do?
I think average score is 50, in the 50s, 50, 55.
And you have to be 80 and over to certify?
The 100,000 that have taken it, yeah. And not, most of them haven't been verified scores. So it's kind of looking at like, what are they? But we can see like the data coming in and going up and down, and we can have a sense of what that looks like. And also all the gears rated companies. So we did have that, thousands of companies go through that system in addition to the certified system as well.
Great. One more, let's see. In a world of all B Corps or at that level of operation, what industries need to be brought into the community?
That's a good question. I think we've been fairly light on tech. And so increasingly seeing tech companies, and even like a New York Times article, so calling for Facebook to be a benefit corp. So we've been light on that. And I think we do have some like more heavy manufacturing companies. We have a great manufacturer called Cascade Manufacturing that makes things like recycling bins and does a lot of work with, recently incarcerated people and creating job paths for them. But we could use more kind of in those like heavy kind of industry, heavy type of industries would be one place. And increasingly starting to see more and more healthcare companies. Certainly it's like complicated, and I think we'll probably have to do some standards development around that.
We keep getting questions. I keep trying to ask my question, but people keep, what accomplishment are you most proud of in your efforts thus far?
I think I don't know if we're proud of it yet, but I think the most important thing is the work that we're stepping into on racial equity and being an anti-racist organization. I'm not proud of anything we've done yet because we're still figuring out what we're going to do, but we're getting buy-in from our community and engaging on this and learning and looking who we need to follow and where we need. And I think that's kind of the most important thing that we need to be doing. And we want to drive an inclusive economy in the US. White supremacy culture is a thing that is holding us back, and we need to address this head on and talk about it more. And I'm proud that B Corps will kind of rally together to go after things like we have with net zero. And so we're kind of translating power of community into collective action. And then, as I said at the beginning, then into kind of from there, like coalition building with others. And so kind of this ability to kind of multiply impact just based on kind of this foundational thing of like high performing business leaders coming together.
Great. I'm going to ask this final question and then we'll close it out, but would be curious to hear what the typical size of companies you mostly see demand from in terms of revenue and or employees.
Oh yeah, good question. I mean, most of our community are small private companies under 10 million revenue. I think it's about 80% are under 10 million revenue. So that's the core. There continue to be tons of those companies. There's many of those companies in the US. We're fortunate in our market to also have some larger companies. That kind of mix of portfolio creates a really nice kind of vibrant community. And we see the larger companies kind of bringing brand influence, but we see the smaller companies, like the bigger companies coming in because they want the kind of innovation and community. And Lorna Davis, who's the CEO of Danone, when she certified, she was like, we came because you guys like walk the walk and you've created community around that. And we want to be part of that. And that was cool. Like you're running a $5 billion company, most companies, 80% of them are under 10 million revenue. That's pretty cool.
Awesome. So maybe as a means of closing it out, I'll throw in my last question, which is that there are a lot of students on this call, a lot of young people who are really excited about using business, hopefully as a force for good in the future. What is your advice for them? What are first steps towards maybe making their businesses become a B Corp? Any closing thoughts?
Yes, so we have a jobs board called bwork, bwork.com, so you can go look for jobs there. I really encourage everybody to crack open the B Impact Assessment. There's tons of learning in that, and you can bring that as like currency for you. You can bring that to your next job. It'll help educate you kind of across all these different dimensions of like how to run a good business. And I think that will kind of like fortify the experience that you're getting right now. And you can then encourage your company to kind of start working on those practices, even if they don't become a B Corp, starting down the road. And we increasingly want other companies that aren't B Corps to join collective action like our net zero work. And so there's ways to engage and connect into our community there. And we also have 25 B local groups. And so there's a New York B local, and I think you can get on the newsletter list for any of those and kind of stay on the pulse of what's going on. There's a great academic community called B Academics. And so there's, I think, 500 or so academics in the US, and this is also a global thing. So there's lots of connection points. And I would find just one or two people who are working at a B Corp and see what happens from there.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much to Ben and Georgia for joining us tonight. Thank you to the Bernstein Center, to Diana from the Tamer Center, who really masterminded all of this. We learned so much about B Lab. And thank you so much to our audience members for joining us tonight. And we hope to see you all again at a future event.